Uh, I'm going to try and discuss this topic in as much detail as I can without getting ponderous, because it's quite a big topic, and I'm going to try and contextualize a little bit of prehistory, or a little bit of the historical discussion of Dal Riada by looking a little bit into prehistory and looking at the situation of Antrim and Argyll, their location, their proximity, and how the sea is very much a linker as much as it is a divider between them. I'll probably, because I've got quite a lot to get through, I'll not waste any more time. I'm going to try and share a screen, and then I may turn off my camera so as to try and... can everyone see that? Anyone see my PowerPoint?
Not yet, Cormac.
Is that it now?
Yeah, that's it now.
That's it. So I'm just going to right to the start, and I'm going to try and keep this to about to just under an hour, and then leave a little bit of time for questions afterwards. That's just okay. So the Kingdom of Dal Riada. The Kingdom of Dal Riada was, as I'm sure many of you know, an early medieval kingdom which existed on both sides of the North Channel. And in some respects, it's emblematic of the close interrelationships of Ireland and Scotland, in particular the southwest of Scotland and the northeast of Ireland. But it's a relationship, a close relationship, which predates the Dal Riada by a very long period. The Dal Riada are really just part of a continuum, part of a process which has been happening or going on between northeast Ireland and southwest Scotland for thousands of years. Occasional periods of punctuation, which are in some respects as interesting as the continuums, but nevertheless, the default position has been for ancient people for most of that period to have been closely linked along that stretch of water. The first colonists, I really try and very quickly run through this. We don't actually know exactly when the first colonists arrived in Ireland. We have radiocarbon dates, many of you will be aware, from Mount Sandal, which show that there was some sort of settlement there. But the ice was retreating from about 17,000 BC, roughly, and it's not until about 8,000 BC that we get firm settlement evidence at Mount Sandal and other early medieval settlements in Ireland. There is some evidence in Scotland for settlement in southern Scotland around about 11,000 BC, at a place called Holborn in Lanarkshire. Recently, there has been an excavation which has revealed a settlement or an area of apparent settlement which flourished for maybe a century or two before quite possibly being pushed back by a very cold snap called the Younger Dryas, which occurs around 10,000 BC, a cold snap before the Gulf Stream becomes properly established and leaves us with our current climate. I think there's very good reason to believe these people might have made their way onto the Irish landmass. And since we know they're in southern Scotland, the most likely route is probably to have been across into County Antrim, but we don't know that with certainty, and we haven't found any solid evidence of settlements this early in Ireland. As I mentioned, and as many of you will already know, all about Mount Sandal, of course, excavated in the late 1960s, early 1970s by a local man, Peter Woodman, then working for the Ulster Museum, later Professor of Archaeology at University College Cork. And he found this wonderfully well preserved early Mesolithic settlement in Mount Sandal. And I'm not going to talk too much about it. As I say, I'm sure many of you are aware of quite a lot of the details about it. But there was tremendous preservation in the pits and in the hearths of food materials. This was the first really modern scientific excavation that had been carried out in Northern Ireland, with the full suite of modern scientific applications of soil sampling, plant macrofossil analysis, radiocarbon dating, identification of animal bones at a very detailed level. Those sort of things built up a fantastically textured picture of the people who lived at Mount Sandal in the Mesolithic period. We found very characteristic microlithic tools. Microlithic means very small stone tools, basically, which are essentially composite tools. Lots of little flints which were set into bone or into wood. Shafts, if you like, to create more complex tools such as harpoons and knives. And we find extremely similar Mesolithic, microlithic tools in Western Scotland at the same time. As this Middle Stone Age, this Mesolithic, these hunter-gatherer communities, as their society develops, I suppose, for maybe the right word, there is change in the types of artifacts they use. They start to develop a slightly different type of tool type. They start to make larger flint tools, very characteristic larger flint tools. In Ireland, we tend to call these the Larnian culture, which is a name which the Harvard mission to Ireland in the 1930s came up with because they found so many of this type of stone tools in Larne. And of course, then they went across to the west of Scotland and found exactly the same type of stone tools in caves around Oban, and they called it the Abanian in Scotland. They're not exactly the same, but they're very, very, very similar. And the indication from the artifact types that we get in the Irish Middle Stone Age Mesolithic, that these hunter-gatherers are probably a very similar population group on either side of the North Channel, but they're not necessarily in regular contact. That's probably because, quite simply, they hadn't got the boat technology to be in very regular contact. And there is a certain amount of a cultural drift happens over time. One of the things, of course, is that the Albanian develops in time, that the flint techniques develop slightly differently, and they also are more likely to use things like seal bones and whale bones and stuff like that, which are not typically found in the Irish Mesolithic assemblages. Mesolithic life, don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but I just want to refute one sort of slur, almost, if you like, on very primitive societies, which is Thomas Hobbes' famous quote about life being nasty, brutish, and short. In some respects, this was one of the best times to be alive, and of course, lots of people suggest that the sort of Garden of Eden is a reflection of the ancient Mesolithic lifestyles of hunter-gatherers before we discovered good and bad and how to farm. And there's probably a reason for believing why life might have been quite good. You're not dependent on a small group of food crops. You're not dependent on 3 or 4 crops and a couple of types of animals. And if one crop or one type of animal gets sick or one crop fails, that you may face hunger or maybe even starvation. These ancient hunter-gatherers had dozens, in fact hundreds of food sources which they could draw on. And if the crab apples aren't so good one year, well, who's going to worry as long as the damsons and the hazelnuts don't fail? And likewise, if there's not a great run of salmon, well, at least we've got the eels, and hopefully maybe we have the mackerel and the pollen or whatever else is available. And the number of food species which were found at Mount Sandal, which is many dozens, suggests that it's not unreasonable to typify this as an age of relative plenty. They haven't got the National Health Service, but I don't think they were missing much else, essentially at that period of time. The first farmers arrive in our landscape probably just a little bit after 4000 BC. One of the first ways we detect them first ways that they were detected, apart from their artifacts, were in early environmental studies, where samples taken from bogs were examined to see what types of pollen are in them. And this is a depiction of an archaeologist's or a paleoenvironmentalist's pollen diagram on the right side of the screen here. And you can see that as how different frequencies of different pollen are mapped out through the different depths of the core. And you'll see on the left-hand side, under Pinus and Quercus, pine and oak, and Ulmus elm, there's an arrow, and in the center of the arrow it says Neolithic Landnam. Well, Landnam's a Danish word which means land taking or something like that. And it's come to represent a period which occurs across Europe at this period of time, or around this period of time when all the trees seemed to disappear. And it seems to be linked with the emergence of the first farmers. The first farmers arrive, they find an entirely wooded landscape, they cut down trees to make fields, and those trees are missing, if you like, in the pollen diagram. So you can see how the oak, that's quercus, pine, pinus, ulmus, elm, all sort of hit a decline around about 490 centimeters below the top of that at the top of that bog sample. If you look at the sample depth column on the left hand side, you'll also notice that the herbs, which are all in green, all rise in frequency at about the same time that the trees are dropping in frequency. And this is the sign of an open landscape, a landscape being created by farmers. And on the left-hand side, there's a rather bad, actually, picture. So I just grabbed these, they're copyright free. I grabbed these very quickly. A picture of an excavation ongoing of the foundation of a Neolithic house, a Neolithic rectangular timber house. It's one room of Neolithic, two-room Neolithic house. And you can see the deep rectangular foundation trench of one of the rooms. On the right-hand side, there's a 3D sort of computer graphic reconstruction of one of those Neolithic houses. And we don't often find evidence of, although evidence for charred thatch has been found, but we do very often find that the charred timbers of the construction slots. And there are quite a few of these, the one from County Antrim and also the corresponding parts of the west of Scotland. Actually, the number of these settlements, farmhouses, if you like, that's what we believe they are, because you sometimes find food remains, things like that, pottery, broken pottery, and things like that in them. The number that these that have been found in recent years in the Irish landscape is enormous. We have found, well over 100 over the past 20 years of sort of rescue, 30 years of rescue excavation. And it seems reasonable now to consider that the entire Irish landscape, at least the bits which have the right sort of soil for early Neolithic farming, which likes quite a light soil really, but that the whole of the Irish landscape is probably scattered in these. And likewise, the same is true for the whole of the Scottish landscape. And these houses are being constructed around 37 or 3800 BC, that sort of era. And it's just some radiocarbon dates. And they all appear at once all over the place, which is quite interesting, but I'm not going to get into that. But if you can probably see the shape of those black shapes, which show the probability of radiocarbon date statistical process. Of course, it's got a plus or minus, and it also has to be calibrated. So that black shape around about 3600 to 3700 BC in that graph shows that most of the Neolithic houses appear at around about the same time across the whole of the Irish and probably across the whole of the British landscape as well. We've had quite a high population. Missing a screen in the Neolithic period. Also, it seems that the boats were a little bit better than they were for the hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic beforehand. These Neolithic farmers, they are able to move around and trade a lot more. And of course, that's to be expected because we know they brought cattle with them. And if you can build a good enough boat to throw a couple of tied cattle on their sides and take them, well, possibly from Brittany or maybe even the west of Britain up through the Irish Sea and to make landfall around the Irish and Scottish coasts, well, you need to be reasonably good at seamanship. So we know they had fairly good boats, and they seem to have traded certainly between Ireland and Scotland, and in fact, probably other places as well. A number of illustrations here. The west of Scotland has not got particularly good flint resources. Most of the good quality flint that we find in the west of Scotland seems to have come from Ireland. But in the other direction, one of the things that's quite commonly found in East Antrim is a thing called pitchstone. Pitchstone has probably only one geological source. Certainly only one's been identified, and that is on the island of Arran. It's one that I'm aware of anyway. I think there might be hints that there might be a second somewhere. So I'm not going to just put my hand on my heart, but certainly the main source is on the island of Arran, where pitchstone, and it's basically a very, very, very hard, glassy stone. It's a form of jet or agate, really, I think. would be probably the best description. It's harder than flint. It doesn't fracture just as well as flint, but it makes even sharper blades than flint. And it's still used today in some specialist surgical tools. And pitchstone is found across the East Antrim coast. And it's being brought to Antrim from Ireland because there is no source of pitchstone, certainly in Ireland. So this may well be an example of a reciprocal trade, with flint going one way and pitchstone going another. Trade is slightly different in the way that archaeologists talk about it anyway, slightly different from exchange, because trade, of course, implies that you have a need and the other person has a need, and you get together and swap. There's some sort of reciprocal relationship going on there. But exchange is something slightly different, because exchange perhaps involves things which don't necessarily require a trade of an object, which maybe instead are symbolic, or maybe build an obligation rather than necessarily have a price, if you like. And the distribution of stone axes, in particular the porcelainite stone axes, which come from Tíb Buile and also on Broccoli and Rathlin. Porcelainite is a very hard black basalt, a nice fine grain, which is absolutely perfect for making stone axes. And there's a little hill, little mountain really, behind Cushendun called Tíb Buile, which is an outcrop of this very, very fine grained hard rock. You can actually take a walk up there and find chips of it all over the place. And there was an axe factory there, a quarry, if you like, and a place where rough axes were chipped out before being brought down the mountain and finished off. And there's also a similar outcrop and similar axe factory, if you like, on Rathlin, Broccoli and Rathlin. And these these are the only two sources of porcelainite in the world. And we find it very much concentrated in Northeast Ireland, but also quite a lot across Scotland, in particular running sort of northeast to southwest, or southwest to northeast, I suppose, through Argyll and up into northeast Scotland. And also there's a scatter down through the spine of England too. And the odd one seems to have been identified in continental Europe, in mainland France and places like that. So this is a widely exchanged. And I say it's exchanged as opposed to traded because they're actually perfectly good, of course, stones for making axes all over Ireland and Britain. There are good outcrops every so many miles, but it's the exotic nature of these which probably makes people prize them, and it's likely that they're given away at various different social functions rather than in a mercantile sense. So they may well be given away at moments of marriage, or possibly moments of alliance, something like maybe the Kula Shaker ceremonies, of course, that we know from anthropology, that type of thing. Very quickly talk about stone tombs and monuments. Again, very much an Irish-Scottish aspect to some of the monument types. In fact, what we now call court tombs have suffered from what I call jurisdictional archaeology. They used to be back in the 1950s and 60s. They used to be called Clyde Carlingford tombs. But then, as in the post-war period, as we developed regional archaeological authorities all over the place in Scotland and in Northern Ireland and the Republic, we started to change the nomenclature of some of the monuments to reflect more the area, accidentally, it wasn't done deliberately, to reflect the jurisdictional area. So we ended up with court tombs in Ireland, and we ended up with chamber tombs in Scotland, whereas back in the days of Stuart Piggott in the post-war years, they were called Clyde Carlingford tombs, because actually they exist across both areas and they're very, very similar. And here's a few examples. On the left-hand side, Tammany Rankin, which is a great court tomb if you want to visit it, up near Swatragh. It's got a signpost off the main Swatragh Garva Road, and it's got a car park which is big enough for a bus. So if you want, although you do go up a fairly long loaning for a few miles, to use the vernacular, before you actually, a few miles, but a mile before you get to the tomb. But there is a turning circle which a bus can turn on if anybody is organising a field trip. On the right hand side, we've a court tomb, a Clyde Carlingford tomb, or a chambered cairn, or chamber tomb from Scotland, Very, very similar. This one is a little bit taller orthostats at the front, flanking the court, but effectively they're morphologically exactly the same. They're a semicircular court with then the chambers and the body of the tomb behind them, and the assumption that various different communal rituals happened in the court, which were connected to, but possibly separate from, the actual committal of the human remains into the tomb itself. Without talking too much about the recent, I'll mention very briefly the recent advances in DNA analysis that have just really landed, I suppose, in archaeology in the past 3 or 4 years. We now know that the Neolithic farmers are probably not related to the Mesolithic people beforehand. We're not closely related. I'm sure some of them survived and intermarried with the Neolithic farmers. And we also know that the Neolithic farmers probably ultimately have a Mediterranean or even Near Eastern origin, because that's where farming came from. Farming moved from the Near East through Europe, starting about in the Natufian era, as it's called, in the Near East about 9000 BC, and taking 4,000 or 5,000 years to cross Europe before it hits Ireland and Britain around about 3,900 or 4,000 BC. And these people were the descendants mostly of Near Eastern farmers. Of course, like everyone else, they met new people and intermarried as they went through Europe, and they contained a certain amount of the DNA, if you like, of the hunter-gatherers that they encountered and intermarried with on the way. But their population group is primarily of Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern origin. Then around 2,400, 2,500, a new group appear in our archaeological record. And recently, DNA analysis has been carried out on a lot of these remains. Some of it isn't published yet, but some has been published. I can talk about what has been published. 3 skeletons from Rathlin Island were analysed for their DNA, and their DNA was found to be also a mixture of European DNAs that you would expect, but it had a very high component of DNA from the steppes of Russia compared to the ancient DNA from the steppes of Russia, from what would be called the Yamna culture of the steppes of Russia. And now similar work has been carried out in other parts of Europe, and more work's ongoing in Ireland. This seems to be a trend across Northern and Central Europe of a new group coming, and I suppose to some extent displacing the earlier farmers, a new group who are metal workers. And one of the interesting, it seems that most of the bulk of the Irish and Scottish population have most of their inheritance seems to be very similar to these Yamna settlers of 2000, 2400 BC, the examples that we have at Rathlin. In fact, many of the inherited diseases that are now very prevalent in our population, such as hemochroma, I can't remember what you call it, the iron blood disorder, and also cystic fibrosis, and a number of other conditions that are very common in Irish and the Scottish populations appear. The genes for those appear in these Rathlin burials of about 2000-ish BC. And these are a new burial type which arrived with these first metal workers. And again, the Irish and Scottish continuum is vitally important here. When the first metal workers arrive, well, we know because of radiocarbon dating of a single mine in County Kerry at Ross Island, where they set up a little settlement beside a mine that they started working this mine about 2400 BC. And we know that almost all, or in fact all of the copper which has so far been analysed from Bronze Age Scotland, or early Bronze Age Scotland at least, for the first 500 or 600 years of the Scottish Bronze Age comes from this single mine at Ross Island in County Kerry. It is a very specific isotopic signature, which when, well actually not isotopics, trace element signature of arsenics and things like that, which when analysed show that all of these Scottish tools are been made by Irish metal. And the Irish metal seems to be being brought by traders in the same route as the porcelainite into Argyll and then up into the northeast of Scotland. In fact, you could almost do a small lecture on the similarities of Bronze Age archaeology in northeast Scotland, Perthshire, that kind of area, and County Kerry. Such as the strength of the metalwork trade at this time. Other ways that this manifests itself is in burial, of course. These people bring a new burial ritual with them, or at least they start a process of change of burial ritual. Burial goes away from the big stone tombs and starts being focused on individual burials, and initially in stone boxes. Initially just ordinary inhumation burials, and then cremation gradually taking over and cremated in urns. The burial ritual on either side of the North Channel is very simple, or very similar, sorry, here, as you can see from these two photographs, sets of photographs. One's a burial in Dublin on one side, and a burial in Alloa on the other side, Clonmartinshire. And although two not the same burials, but then two funerary vessels with a Scottish in the ceramic types, and the similarity in the funerary ritual at this period in time. As you go east in Scotland, the funerary ritual changes a little bit, not that much, changes a little bit. The ceramic type changes, and this is what's called the classic Beaker burial. Some of you might have heard, I'm sure, of Beaker burials. Beaker burials are very much the sort of the archetype of this era of these we now know step warriors and copper workers, and probably horse riders as well, sweeping across Europe. That they're, if you like, their most famous artifact is the Beaker, and they're sometimes called Beaker people after it. And this is an example of a Beaker burial from the east of Scotland. Well, not really east, it's near Inverness, called Duffel, but outside, if you like, the really southwest area. And it is a little bit different from Irish burials. You get a slightly different set of artifacts with them. But the really interesting thing about this burial is that the Culduffel burial was subject to isotopic analysis. And this guy grew up in County Antrim. So we have a mixing of peoples, a mixing of ceramic styles, a mixing of burial styles, a mixing of cultures and artifacts going on, as always, somewhere on the ferry, somewhere on the Lord-Stranraer ferry. Bronze Age settlements I'll not talk too much about. I want to save as much time as possible, but we used to have many Bronze Age settlements. It's funny in archaeology, we get sometimes periods where we get lots of ritual activity and we don't get much settlement. And then we get periods where we get lots of settlement and not much evidence for ritual activity. Well, the early Bronze Age was one of the periods where we didn't have much evidence for settlement, but recently we seem to have found quite a lot more. But again, on both sides of the North Channel. We're starting to run into early Bronze Age settlement sites. And we possibly missed them because a lot of them are in upland locations. Late Bronze Age is also a period where there's very considerable similarity across the whole of Ireland and Britain, actually, in the late Bronze Age, a very considerable similarity. We have the beginnings of what are hill forts, in Ireland around about 1100 BC, probably in Scotland around about the same time. We used to think that the Irish stuff actually was a little earlier. This is an old slide. I just changed the colour and I forgot to change the text. We actually now know that in England that they're starting at about the same time, about 1100 BC. But it's also a culture which is hierarchical. It's a culture where we're seeing the emergence of really powerful elites for the first time, elites who control the copper trade, control the production of bronze. And one of the ways that they maintain power, if you like, is this old sort of shimmy that elites always do, which is pretending you're just like us, you know? And the way they do that is through feasting. So they maintain this feasting culture, where presumably most likely just all of the men are brought into the tent with the lord and the king or the chief or whatever name he gave himself, and everyone feels included because even though they may only get a little portion out of the pot compared to what the king gets, they're still getting out of the pot. So it's literally the classic big tent, if you like. And this is a very hierarchical society, very wealthy society, which keeps social cohesion through rituals like the big tent, where everybody's getting a portion of the feast that comes out of the huge cauldron, but also keeps, as you can see from the profusion of weapons, keeps power through weapons, and also keeps bronze valuable by this process of deposition of huge amounts of bronze in watery places. One of the ways that elites manage to keep in power is by making sure that the value of the things that give them status or that give them wealth is maintained. So, for instance, you may go into a supermarket, you may see a few things with yellow labels stuck on them reduced, but you know that they actually dump 20 times as much as that, because if they put all the unsold stuff out for sale, the price would plummet. The same was true in the Bronze Age. Elite groups spend a huge amount of time taking bronze effectively out of circulation, depositing it in watery places. And this is done as a ritual practice. It's done to probably placate the gods, possibly connect it with burial rituals, but it's also done to keep the price of bronze up, the price of copper up. About 600 BC, we're getting into the Iron Age. The Iron Age probably starts around 700 BC. It may not necessarily need a large migration of people. There may just be a small group of iron workers perhaps move. We start to see anyway from about 700 BC in Ireland and Britain, maybe a little earlier in the south of England, we start to see iron being routinely used. And we also see other cultural trends from Central Europe starting to make their presence across Britain and Ireland. In an earlier generation, we would have described this as the products of the beginnings of Celtic invasions. That's not generally considered. It's not a fashionable explanation in archaeology nowadays. And I think that's probably with good reason, actually. We realized that the Celts was a bit too much of a catch-all term. Certainly, there were all sorts of little micro-migrations and sometimes big migrations going on across Europe. But actually, there is not that much evidence for a major migration, really, certainly into Ireland. And even really there certainly were some migrations into the south of England in the Iron Age, but maybe not so much that they were enough to completely change the nature of society. When when we talk about, and I'm not an expert in this, many of you may know more than me about this, but many contemporary theories about the spread of Celtic languages, shall we say, to Britain and Ireland would tend to focus more on the Bronze Age, and maybe even the spread of the Yamna people, who were almost certainly spoken Indo-European language that was related to the Celtic languages. That might be really the cockpit for the development of Celtic languages rather than later in the Iron Age, but that's a debate for itself. So initially, very little change, apart from that the society starts to use iron to make things out of. Very often they look very like the earlier artifacts, but then there's a big gap. There's a gap for several hundred years when nothing is visible basically at all in the Irish archaeological record. This is a gap which is not really matched in Britain to the same extent. Nobody knows really why there's this 300, 400 year period for which there's practically no archaeological evidence. It could be that there's a political crisis caused by really iron effectively undermining the copper market, which leads to some sort of political collapse. It may be that there are environmental problems, and certainly the end of the Bronze Age is a cold and damp period, or it could be that we're missing something big, something else. And I have a couple of theories about this that I might just hint at before we finish off the end. Round about 3,300 BC, we start to see the emergence of this Latin art style, this sort of what we associate with the sort of ultimate sort of Celtic art type stuff. Wonderful material. Got the band disc there, of course, on the right hand side, and then in the middle there's the Lisna Crocker scabbards. A couple of photos of Lisna Crocker scabbards. And the churro stone on the bottom left hand side, and that torque is I think the torque that's with the forgetting the name of them, spell blank, the name of the horde. But those are very, very, very famous set of classic lateen decorated objects in Ireland, which seems to evidence, say, not necessarily a new population group, it's a new artistic style, certainly new influences in Ireland. But again, there isn't a huge amount of evidence for settlement in this period, even though we can begin to see people doing things again in the Irish landscape. We also begin to see evidence for provincial-sized kingdoms forming. Actually, there may be evidence in the Bronze Age for provincial-sized kingdoms, but of course we have this hiatus in the early Iron Age where we can't see very much happening. But certainly by the time of Christ, roughly, we have clear evidence for 4 large, or maybe actually 5 large kingdoms, and we have for each one we've got some very similar central places or royal capitals, if you like, for each of these large kingdoms, supported with a certain amount of historical evidence. Obviously, the historical evidence, things like the Ulster Cycle and various different Irish annals and Metrical Dinseanachus and other accounts are much later and are put through, if you like, not just a religious filter by the monks who wrote them, but also much in the way that, old versions of King Arthur on TV that we used to watch years ago always imagined King Arthur as a sort of a high Middle Ages sort of a king, where in fact, if he existed, he was a much more sort of 5th, 6th century king, completely different in many respects. Likewise, when the monks wrote these stories, they imagined the Ulster Cycle tales as an early medieval sort of royal king rather than an Iron Age one. So there's always those caveats when we use the historical evidence. And I don't want to talk too long about these, just apart from to say that there are these provincial capitals across the whole of Ireland at this time, covering the whole of the Irish landmass, really. 4 or 5 provinces. The 5th province, Meath, of course, continually being squeezed by the other 4. In the early centuries AD, we got one of the first solid documentary pieces of evidence for Ireland, and Ptolemy's map. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about it, given the time constraints, but I want to return again to this thing that is one of the big problems really for Iron Age studies in Ireland, is that we really don't know where they live. We can find, now I've made a typo in this, I say we can find plenty of settlements in Ireland which appear to date to the Iron Age. No, we can find plenty of settlements in Scotland which appear to date to the Iron Age, such as the famous Brochs. And these are a few examples of the famous Brochs. There's also a sort of a shorter version of the Broch, which in Scotland they call it Dún. Of course, we use the term Dún as well. It's a Gaelic term meaning a fortification, essentially. So, but in Scotland, the west of Scotland and the north of Scotland, the coastal areas and central areas are covered in these Brochs and Duns. And there's most of them, which have been excavated, show that they extend to really about the 2nd century BC, sort of commencing around about 150 to 200 BC, and they continue in intermittent use through the Iron Age and into the early Middle Ages. It's very hard indeed to point to similar settlements in Ireland at the same time. There are settlements that look very similar, such as these stone cashels, but most of the evidence for these stone cashels, the archaeological evidence, or for that matter, documentary evidence, for which there is some, suggests that they don't predate the patrician very much. We might potentially conceive of these as being, some of them as old as maybe 300 AD perhaps, but the idea that some of these might be 200 BC doesn't seem to match at all with any of the archaeological evidence. There might maybe be a few cases possibly out there which might buck the trend, but if they do, archaeological excavation has not managed to substantiate that. And what evidence we do seems to suggest the bulk of these being built between about 400 and 800 AD. The same is true for their earthen equivalent, the Rath or ring fort, which are also common across the Irish landscape. So finally, I'm going to get down to talking about Dalriada. And just going to check the time here. I just want to check exactly where I am That's okay. That's all right. Back to this slide again. The Dal Riada, as I said, is really the cockpit, if you like, of Irish, I think anyway, of Irish, Scottish, Ulster, and West of Scots relationships over the whole suite of history. It symbolises it, and it's also one of the periods of time where it becomes most manifest, the close relationships between the two zones. Dalriada emerges in the early medieval period, or maybe the late Iron Age period. There are two separate strands of information about Dalriada. Two separate strands and two separate stories, supported by multiple early medieval texts in Gaelic and in Latin from Ireland, from Scotland, and also from England. The core of these stories is always that there is a migration of this group called the Dal Riada from Ireland to Argyll sometime in the early centuries AD. The Ruada tradition suggests that this happens, well, maybe around the 2nd or 3rd century AD. The Sons of Earth tradition suggests that it happens around the time of Patrick in the 5th century AD. One of the main sources for the Ruada tradition, there are multiple, but one of the best and the most accepted is Bede, the Venerable Bede. And he's writing in the early 8th century, and he says this wonderful quote: "They came from Ireland under their leader Ruada, and they won land amongst the Picts, either by friendly treaty or the sword. This they still possess. They are still called Dal Rudini after this leader." And that is the story which explains the name through an eponymous leader many centuries before, and explains their consistency, if you like, in their place. Now, Bede was a monk, of course, and he was certainly Lindisfarne, and he was certainly friendly with Adaman, the biographer of Columcille and abbot of Iona. And it seems likely that Bede had a direct informant, if you like, as to what was perceived to be the origins of the Dal Riada at around 700 AD. Now, that does not mean that it actually is the origins of the Dal Riada, but it certainly means that it was the perceived origins of the Dal Riada around 700 AD. The second tradition is the Sons of Earth tradition. Now, the second tradition, for a start, it mentions the name Dal Riada or Dal Riada, sometimes spelled with a D. Earlier versions are typically spelled with a T. Excuse me. Later accounts generally put the D in for the Dal Riada or Dal Riada as opposed to Dal Riata. It's a version of the name, but they accept the name Dal Riata or Dal Riada, but they don't dwell on it. They dwell instead on the Sons of Earth, and specifically Fergus MacEirc, who was one of 12 brothers. And Fergus MacEirc and a couple of his brothers essentially get land in Scotland in this story with the approval of Patrick, and for which Patrick is rewarded with church land in Ireland, or given land for the church in Ireland. And the remainder of the sons stay in Ireland. The other 9 brothers stay in Ireland and become significant aristocrats in North Ulster in their own right. This is this sort of story that Patrick makes a prophecy in the tripartite life of St. Patrick, which is the main account, or the most expansive account. And in that, Patrick promises Fergus MacEirc that, if he does what he's told and he's a good boy, essentially, it gives him some land, that his descendants will be kings in Fortran. I think Fortran, which is an old name for the Pictish lands in Scotland, and that their descendants will be kings there forever. And since we're talking about royal stories, I know someone was saying in the media the other day that Queen Elizabeth is descended from Brian Boru. she is, at least theoretically, according to medieval genealogies via the Stuarts, I think, also descended from Fergus MacEirk. So in a sense, Patrick's prophecy, if it wasn't made several hundred years after the event, which is very likely, after the MacEirk dynasty were well established as kings of Dalriada, but if it wasn't after the event prophecy, it seems to have possibly come true, at least so far anyway. So this story is told in many different Irish accounts and Scottish accounts right through into the High Middle Ages as the main story for the origins of Dalriada and the Dalriada royal family. Bizarrely, this has become a very active area of debate in recent years, so much so that it's even led to articles in the Times of London. And this is because of a Glasgow archaeologist called Ewan Campbell, who has written an article saying that he really disagrees with that he sees little actual evidence of a Dalriadic invasion, if you like, of Western Scotland, and that instead he believes that what we're really seeing is thousands of years of interaction across the North Channel, leading to a sort of a shared culture and a shared language that which emerges simultaneously, if you like, or through a million micro interactions rather than one big event on either side of the North Channel. He suggests that the references to Fergus and the sons of Erk are all very late, and that they really relate to the fact that by the 10th or 11th century, the Scottish monarchy has got Irish ancestry, and they're very keen to emphasize their Irish ancestry. But he says that they create this Fergus myth, if you like, so as to justify themselves as the descendants of Dalriadic kings and having authority as descendants of kings of Tara and High Kings of Ireland, as having therefore authority to be and having authority to be, if you like, kings of Scotland. He suggests that this is essentially a politically motivated tale. And there is a lot of value in this critique. I think that the language idea is fascinating. and many people have looked at this, many linguists have looked at this, think that it's worth further consideration. But several parts of his analysis are unfortunately flawed. And they're flawed both from archaeological perspective, and they're also flawed from a historical perspective. It's very good that he's anti-invasionist. I kind of like that, and many archaeologists like that, because to be honest with you, invasions are too simple sometimes. It's easy to reach for an invasion as an explanation of everything. Oh, it must be an invasion. It must be a huge migration of people to explain any change in the archaeological record. But when we actually look at migrations and when we look at invasions, we realize that his main point, which is you don't see many classic Irish artifact types of the Dalriadic period being brought to Scotland to justify an invasion. He misunderstands to a certain extent that the archaeological signature of migration. Whenever you have a group of warrior aristocrats, an army, if you like, who invade a new place, they rarely bring their pots with them. They rarely bring their potters, they rarely bring their metal workers, and they don't bring their homes with them. If it's just a group of soldiers who are intent on carving out a new territory, and they arrive in a new territory, possibly a few hundred or maybe a couple of thousand soldiers, it wouldn't be the same scale as an invasion today. They may well cut the head off the snake, to use the sort of Iraq War term, establish themselves as a new dynasty, a new aristocracy, but they basically take over lock, stock, and barrel, as a going concern, the business that's already there. So very often, those sort of invasionist migrations don't give the sort of archaeological signature that Campbell expects them to. What you do see with those is very often actually new ideas being taken from the land which has been invaded and being brought home. So we can think of the way that curry appears in 19th century England. Something similar we may see in Ireland, and we do actually see that. There are a number of Scottish artifact types which actually appear in Ireland in the post-Dalriadic period, including new types of pottery. In fact, the more or less the reintroduction of pottery as tableware. The Irish didn't use pottery as tableware very much. They used it for industrial purposes, but they didn't think it was suitable tableware. But it seems to be reintroduced by the Dal Riada, and things that we associate nowadays as very Irish, like penannular brooches, are introduced to Ireland at this time, quite possibly through the experiences of the Dal Riada in Scotland. But the other reason why, and I want to skip through quite quickly this, the other reason why it may be that the reason to doubt to Campbell is that his idea that somehow the story of Irk is a fabrication for political purposes seems to be held by a number of other documents, which possibly Campbell wasn't aware of at the time that he wrote his paper. And I want to look in detail at just a little piece in the tripartite life of Patrick. When Patrick, the story of Patrick meeting Fergus MacEirk, in Northampton, shortly before Fergus MacEirk is given the prophecy, if you like, that he would be a king of Dalriada going forward. And there are several elements to the story of the tripartite life of Patrick. The first thing is that Patrick meets a guy called Doro at a place called Carnsetney. Now, Carnsetney is in what's traditionally the land of Dalriada, which is the central piece of County Antrim, not Dalriada, a different kingdom, which was ruled for a very long time by the Lynch family, the Lynches, and he meets Dora at Carnsetney, and then at Carnsetney he finds a baby in a cairn called Alcan. They call him Alcan because Alcan means this is a bad thing to do. They find the baby, his mother dead in the cairn. They hear the baby crying. They excavate the cairn, if you like, and they see that the baby's still alive. He's been born after, if you like, the mother's death. And they say this is a bad thing, and they name him Alcan, which means little wolf, but it also has allusions to badness, little bad person. And then he goes from there further into actual Dalriada and meets Fergus and asks Fergus for land. And Fergus says, well, I'm going to ask my brothers, he says, but if my brothers agree, I'll give you land. And then Patrick prays a little bit with MacNisa, who might be Saint MacNisa, and has a row with MacNisa. MacNisa might have fancied Patrick's sister. Some chroniclers suggest, and that might have been the origin of the row. Patrick then talks to Fergus again and promises Fergus that he would become king of Dalriada above his brothers, and that his children would be kings over fortune forever and ever. Now, this is the 10th century tale, which Campbell says is a political construct of 10th/11th century politics. It could be 10th or 11th century. Campbell says it's a political construct. There is, however, a document which is not very well known, which is in a little bit of an insertion, if you like, an appendix in the Book of Armagh. The Book of Armagh is the most amazing book. The Book of Armagh was compiled or copied about the 9th century, and was made about the 9th century, early 9th century, about 905 or something like that. It's fascinating for two reasons. It is signed by both Brian Borough, who signs it not as King of Ireland, because of course, as a warlord, he wasn't constitutionally King of Ireland, so he signs it apparently in his own hand. Brian Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Irish, and then the only other person who signed it directly under Brian, is Queen Victoria. So there's a royal connection, two royal connections with the Book of Armagh. But stuffed into the back of the Book of Armagh, there's a list of bullet points that some author has put together. Bullet points is the only thing you can call them. called the notuli, the little notes. And the notuli are copied in here around 800 AD, and using language which is at least a century older. So they're a copy of an earlier text, at least the 8th century, possibly 7th century. So the notuli predate the tripartite life of Patrick, and they predate the political machinations of the House of Dunkeld, as it was called, in 10th and 11th century Scotland by 3 or possibly even maybe 4 centuries. And yet, this tiny little snippet that I've illustrated here on the left-hand side has, in abbreviated form, the exact layout of the story, which Campbell says is an 11th or 10th century invention. Doro Carnsetney, meeting Doro at Carnsetney. Mac Irk, that's the sons of Irk. Fergus Moore. It then mentions Mac Nisa. That's Patrick's row with Nisa over him possibly fancying his sister. Then there's Alcan, slightly out of sequence, but then it mentions Alcan, and then Eps, brackets Cop, which almost certainly means episcop, which seems to be a reference to him later becoming a bishop, which isn't directly mentioned in that part of the tripartite life. And then Nem Telach Kinlingso, which is probably a reference to him meeting Fergus at Dunseverick, which is the royal centre of the Dalriada in Ireland. So here in microcosm is a bullet point version for someone who was going to write a full account of part of Patrick's life, being written possibly in the 7th, but definitely no later than the 8th and probably early 8th century. So at least 200 or 300 years, maybe even 400 years before the political events which Campbell says are necessary to justify the creation of a Dalriadic myth. So in all probability, it shows that the Fergus MacEarth myth, or the Fergus MacEarth story, and it may well be a myth, but it was a myth which was believed in the 7th and 8th centuries. And of course, we still come back to Old Bede. Bede is still there as an independent English source, but with a good informant, saying in the early 8th century that the Dalriada are a thing and that they have origins on the other side of the North Channel. There are a number of other little poems and pieces which are separate from the main two stories, which can come in from the sides and support different bits of the Irk and the land of Irk and the Corcaretti, which is a really sort of like archaic version of the people of Ruada. Different texts can come in from different sides and further buttress the story, but it does appear that the core of both types of both strands of Dalriadic myth predate Fergus MacEarth, predate the House of Dunkeld and the 10th, 11th century political situation by quite a long way. So Fergus may well be real. He may well be a real 5th century ancestor of an emergent Scottish monarchy. And it may well be that certainly monarchs right up to the current day, and certainly James the First described himself as a merry monarch sprung for the race of Fergus. And one of the things we forget nowadays is in the Middle Ages, even the High Middle Ages, just how important Irish affairs were to Scottish monarchs. Somebody pointed out, I think Duffy, UCD historian, a few years ago, pointed out in an article, History Ireland, I thought it was fascinating, that the 14th century biography of Robert Bruce devotes something like a third of its pages to affairs in Ireland, but its Victorian biography only devotes 2 pages to affairs in Ireland. So Ireland occupied a vastly more important position, and Scotland occupied a vastly more important position in Irish and Scots perceptions of themselves and their place in the world and their place in history in the Middle Ages than they do today. So I'm just going to move on. I'm not going to talk too much. I just mentioned some of the archaeological forms, ceramic forms, and penannular brooches, and also settlement types, which seem to have been brought from Scotland to Ireland during the Dalriadic period, which actually is more indicative of an invasion by a group of warrior aristocrats as opposed to a migration, say a biblical migration or a late Roman migration, where you have hundreds, thousands of hungry men, women, and children in caravans with pack animals and oxen and pots and kettles hanging off the back of the carts. The invasion of a group of warrior aristocrats has a very different archaeological signature. And the archaeological signature is actually bringing new stuff, exotic stuff home. And this is an example of that's a nice photograph of a Scottish, Western Scots dune. The generally in North Ulster, particularly what would be the coast and Glens area, if you like, there is a form of early medieval Irish monument, settlement monument, which is very, very, very similar to some West of Scots ones, but a number have now been excavated. I've excavated a couple. A number of other people have excavated them, and we've got solid radiocarbon dates that date them to the Dalriadic period and not earlier as they would be if you found them in Scotland. So again, tying in with this idea of new monument types, new artifact types being brought back, if you like, because of experiences in Scotland. The Picts, I want to try and say a wee bit about the Picts if we've time, and the Cruithne as well. The Picts, what does everybody know about the Picts? They don't speak an Indo-European language. They practice inheritance in the female line. They're very remote, and they live in Scotland. Well, the last bit's probably correct. They do live in Scotland, but everything else that we know about the Picts actually needs reassessed and has been reassessed in recent years. Geoffrey Wainwright wrote a lot of this stuff in the post-war years. He had difficulty with Pictish place names, and analysis of Pictish place names since shows that pretty much all Pictic place names are essentially Celtic, to use that term, that linguistic term. They're Celtic names. The Picts do not speak a non-Indo-European language. It used to be thought they spoke something that was a bit like Basque or Magyar or something like that, but we now know they're speaking a Celtic language. We now also doubt, many historians and archaeologists doubt that they practice inheritance in the female line. It seems that this is based on a misreading of two different stories. One, there's a story which is mentioned in various Irish texts and which Bede mentions, which is how the Gaels and the Picts go through Europe migrating in prehistory, which is probably a memory of the migration of Yamna Beakers, probably, now that we know that, new DNA evidence. But the suggestion is that the Picts and the Gaels are migrating in a similar way through Europe, and they migrate through Europe from they say Scythia down to Greece, into Spain, up into Ireland, and then the Picts find themselves embarrassed because they've got no women, they've no wives, so they ask the Gaels, for wives, and the Gaels give them wives, and the understanding that if there's ever a disputed succession in the Pictish king lists, that it will go down through the Irish female side. And this story was repeated by Bede, and then it's been mixed together by historians with the very parsimonious king lists in Scotland, which don't show succession from father to son. And the historians mixed the two stories together and come up with this idea that the Picts must have practiced matrilineal inheritance, which, of course, in the 19th century, early anthropologists are starting to find in exotic bits of the world. And they say, oh, the Picts are practicing matrilineal inheritance. Most historians now think that actually the Picts are practicing a swapping, rotating kingship, very similar to the Irish High Kingship, where it's swapped between the northern and southern Aeneal. And of course, it would never pass from father to son because, well, for a start, Gaeldom had not got a strict father to son succession anyway. And where you've got two houses who swap the monarchy, it can't swap between father and son, even if it was desirous in a particular case. And it seems that they've got the same succession system in Scotland, at least certainly for the Pictish High Kingship. So the Picts don't practice matrilineal succession is probable. If, like Geoffrey Wainwright, you're writing in Oxford, then probably the Picts are remote, but they weren't necessarily remote in the in the 6th or 7th century AD, or if you're coming from somewhere else. So for a number of reasons, we have changed a lot of what we think about the Picts. The Cruithne, of course, quite controversial. Sometimes people talk about the Cruithne because one of the things we've got to remember in archaeology is the past is a completely foreign country, and if they were to look at us, they would think we were nuts. And just as we would probably sometimes about them. But of course, the Cruithne may well be closely related to the Picti. Cruithne is a term derived from Prytani, which of course is the root of the term Britain. And Cruithne is Prytani rendered into a Q Celtic dialect as opposed to a P Celtic dialect. And the Irish annals explicitly sometimes refer to the Cruithne as being Picts. They say that they talk about the Picts in Scotland as the Cruithne of Alba and stuff like that. And the Cruithne is also a name given to the Dalriada and the Eich Cobo in County Down, the Dalriada in Ireland and Antrim and Down. There are also, by the way, Cruithne groups all over Ireland, not just in Ulster. In recent times, Dr. Ian Adamson, of course, wrote Ulster, the Hidden History. Was that Ulster, the Hidden History was him, or yeah, that was it, yes. And there's also another guy, Michael Hall, who wrote very similar books. And they sort of draw a direct line between the Cruithne of ancient times and modern Ulster sort of unionism, loyalism. And it's a great tale, but I think that most academic archaeologists, historians are very wary of linking any group from the past, certainly not the distant past, to the present, because everybody in these two islands has ancestors who are both Picti, Cruithne, Gael, Iverni, everything else. It's so far in the past, and if anybody's ever done any genealogy, you know how many great grandparents and great grandparents you have. We're really too mixed up to draw these lines. And also the fact that what we used to think were very hard categorical differences, like Cruithne and Gael and Pict, seem to be almost dissolving before our eyes as people do more work on things like linguistics and king lists. And we're beginning to think of them as just names of similar tribes, just in slightly different regions, rather than great sort of confederations of people that are eternally different. We don't think that. But certainly the Cruithne once probably controlled much of North and East Ulster. Some people, Alex Wolfe in particular, Scottish historian, has suggested, while also dissolving the distinction between the Picti and the Gael, if you like, has suggested that the Dal Riada themselves, even though they're normally reckoned as part of the Iverni, not Gael, one of the other, technically sort of a separate genealogical groups in early medieval Ireland, but that actually they have originally started off as Cruithne, who thought it was worth their while massaging their ancestry a little bit so as to sidle up to the Ineal, who become dominant across the northern half of Ireland, really. Probably the most powerful group, maybe them and the Northumbrians, but share the title for the most powerful group in certain first half of the early Middle Ages in either Ireland or Britain. So the Dalriada may well massage their ancestry at certain times to look less like the Picts or the Cruithne, and at other times maybe might emphasize their Cruithnic ancestry. All of the groups in Ireland through the early Middle Ages have genealogies which they edit and rub out bits and add in bits as the situation fits. The Dalriada do it, the Dal Riada do it. The only ones who probably, the Ineal probably don't do it very much, and the Dal Theatre, the Ulstermen proper, they're very sure about who they are and where their descent is. The MacDunleavys and all those ones, they were very clear about who they were. They never edited anything, but most of the rest of them did, if it was useful to them. Later, Dalriada. Dalriada in Ireland is weakening from the 7th century onwards. One explanation of this is really that they forsake their alliance with the Ineal at some stage. In the early 7th century, Donald Breck who was the king of Dalriada, gets very close to Congal Congal the One-Eyed, who was the king of Dalriada, and probably at the time the most powerful king in Eastern Ulster, and a contender, definitely a contender for High King. And Donald Breck sort of disagrees to join battle with them against the then ideal High King. And they're very heavily defeated. They're actually wiped out at the Battle of Moira, more or less in 637. Huge toll on the aristocracy of the Dal Riada and the Dal Riada, and they never really recover from it, actually. At the same time, the fortunes of the Dal Riada are starting to slip in Scotland in the 8th century. This is possibly because they no longer have as much support. It's almost certainly because they no longer have as much support from Ireland. They're certainly not going to get the help of the Aníl. And the Dal Riada in Ireland are weakened, so they're not giving them as much support. And they suffer defeat after defeat at the hands of the Pictish king, Angus MacFerguson. Interestingly, of course, that's a Gaelicized name. The Pictish lists describe his name MacFerguson. But it clearly we can see that the Picts of this period are starting to be very Gaelicized. If it took very much to Gaelicize them, we don't know how different their language was from Gaelic. We think it was a little bit different, probably a bit closer to Brittonic or Welsh or something like that, but we don't know for sure. And then he seized Dunad in 736 and then really defeated them in 741. This wouldn't be the total destruction of the Dal Riada. And we know Kenneth MacAlpin, who I'll just talk about for a minute before we go to questions, certainly survived. The other thing, of course, that happens at this time, shock and awe, the Norse arrive, totally unexpected, almost totally unexpected, I think, but certainly totally unexpected in terms of the devastation. They attack initially coastal areas and monasteries. And when they do this hit and run tactics, there's no real defense against them for an early medieval society. When they start to do more inland attacks and when they start to attempt to settle a bit, there's much more effective counterattacks. But through for about 130 years, the Norse pound Ireland and Scotland. In fact, in Ulster, really, from the mid-900s, the Norse are effectively wiped out in Ulster by coordinated action between the Aníl and the Ulstermen proper, Dalriada, down in County Down, do coordinated action against them and wipe them out. But they still, of course, continue to have significant influence in Munster and Leinster, although what really happens is, of course, they make Munster and Leinster fabulously rich, and then the kings of Munster and Leinster become very powerful, and Ulster is gradually eclipsed, but that's another story. But the Dalriada and the Picts are slow to react. But what sort of happens is that it has an interesting effect. The Vikings drive a wedge in the North Channel. It's no longer so easy to communicate between the two. We notice that references to Scotland start to drop off in Irish annals and accounts. It's no longer every other references to Scotland. They're becoming less frequent. The Dalriada are asking for help from assistance. They get assistance from Geoffrey MacFerguson, who comes and helps Kenneth MacAlpin in Scotland. Geoffrey arrives in 835. He fights a battle or two, then nobody hears about him. Everyone must have assumed he died, but then in about 855 he turns up again as the king of the Scottish Vikings. So he sort of changes sides and becomes their king. Interestingly, of course, although his name is Gaelic, Geoffrey MacFerguson, the king of the Argila in central Ulster, his first name is Norse, Geoffrey. It's not a Gaelic name. It's a Gaelicized name, but his name is Norse. And I think there's a clue there. I think that we're limited to what the monks tell us, but I think there's a much longer story of Irish and Scots and Norse interaction going on before the Viking Age. But what happens is that at some stage the Vikings decide we can take their gold, and they try and come and take their gold, and they're quite successful for a while. But leaving aside the fascinating tale of Geoffrey MacFerguson, Kenneth MacAlpin is very important because what seems to happen is that the Dalriada turn their gaze away from the sea, the Scottish Dalriada, they turn their gaze away from Ireland, and they turn their gaze inland. Simultaneously, the Picts are taking a bit of a pounding from the Vikings too, and this probably provides Kenneth with an opportunity. It's possible that Kenneth's mother was a Pict. In fact, it seems likely that his mother is the sister of Angus MacFerguson that we mentioned earlier as having hammered the Dalriada on many occasions. It may well be, if there is any truth to the matrilineal story of Bede and the rest, that it may well be that having a Pictish mother made it easier for him to become the king of the unified, well, wasn't really unified, but there were still lots of under kings, but become effectively the high king of the whole of Scotland, King of Scots, from 843 onwards, and officially considered the first king of Scotland. We must remember, however, that a lot of these early kings of Scotland, a bit like, I suppose, people like Alfred the Great, they were high kings, really. They weren't kings in the modern sense. But because king lists of later kings back projected towards people like Kenneth, we sometimes think that Kenneth MacAlpin was a modern High Middle Ages king. He wasn't. He was very much an early medieval high king. But he was the beginning of something which later became what we now know as the Kingdom of Scots. Viking activity finally gets sort of ends in Ulster in the middle of the 10th century. There's more Viking activity, and of course, Viking towns are established in Leinster and Munster, which eventually come under the power of the provincial kings in Leinster and Munster, and of course help to make them extremely rich. And that doesn't happen in Ulster, and Ulster stays relatively impoverished compared to Munster and Leinster in the later early Middle Ages. Dalriada starts to disappear from the Irish historical records at this time. We have very few references after the 800s. There's a couple of references to, there's a king of Dalriada, son of a king of Dalriada, mentioned in an attack on the Vikings at Wexford in 914. The 986 Viking ships off the coast of Dalriada, right? So a sort of geographic reference to Dalriada as a region rather than Dalriada as a people, if you like. The Dalriada are noted as having killed the king of the Hebrides, probably another assault on the Vikings in 989, or maybe a descendant of Geoffrey MacFerguson, quite possibly. Excuse me. And then the Annals of Ulster, I mentioned the Dalriada killing a Kinlow at part of the Ideal in 1013. That's the last reference to Dalriada as a group or a people. The only other two references in the Irish annals to Dalriada are both to Dalriada as a geographical place. A foray into Dalriada in 1164 and a battle in Dalriada between the Kinlow and the Normans in 1183. There is a reference from 1166 to I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, to be honest with you. The men of Carey, the parish of Carey, and I think it's the Crothagy. The parish of Carey is the anglicisation of it, which of course is a region in northeast Antrim around Ballycastle, between Ballycastle and Cushendun. And it's interesting that they weren't described as being Dalriada or part of the Dalriada. And we can see who fills the vacuum. Well, you might think it's the Anglo-Normans. The Anglo-Normans fill a little bit of the vacuum at one stage, but the actual main vacuum is filled by this group called the Uturtra and their under kingdom, their semi-slaves, serfs, not really, but their under kingdom of the Fairlea, who they dominate. The Uturtra, leading family, the O'Flynn's, almost entirely forgotten about. One of the most successful Irish dynasties of the Middle Ages. They have a lordship in central Antrim, which lasts from 800 AD to almost 1400. They are assaulted by all comers, including John de Courcy. They give John de Courcy his single biggest defeat at Tuam in 1183 or 84. It might be in the next slide. And they almost kill de Courcy. They kill about 25 of his knights. There's 25 knights Norman sources don't mention people apart from knights dying, but for every knight, you can bet your bottom dollar there's probably 50 or 100 footmen died. So an enormous defeat for de Courcy. It stops de Courcy essentially in his tracks and stops him really conquering East Ulster. He sets up the lordship or the earldom of Ulster, but it's really just a little coastal strip in southeast Antrim and a little bit in Down, well, half of Down. But he never really makes substantive gains into North Antrim, Central and North Antrim, and that's because of the Aturtra. And the Aturtra continue to hold land right the whole way through the Norman period. And people ask, why do they do this? They certainly, at one stage, control the land of the. At one stage, they control the land of the Dal Riada. When the Anglo-Normans actually probably take most of Dal Riada and leave the Aturtra with their core territory, which they don't seem tough enough to take off at the Aturtra. And there's also an area of what would be called the Inner Glens, which was claimed by the Bissets, who later became the McEwens, but almost certainly stayed in the control of the Aturtra right through to the end of the 14th century, when the last Aturtra king died without an heir. And the O'Neills, not the Normans, but the Clandyboy O'Neills, take over their kingdom. The reason why the Aturtra are so successful even through the Norman period is probably down to this and a number of others around central Antrim. One of the things that Dr. Tom McNeill, medieval archaeology lecturer for many years in Queen's, retired there a little while ago, 2 years ago. Tom McNeill observed that a lot of Norman mottes are in places where there were no Normans. And he speculated that not every mott was being built by the Normans. And it looks like the Aturtra were mott builders. And that's Harryville Mott in Ballymena. They also built motts in Larryford. They built Clough. There's several motts around Ballymena. Possible mott in Port Glenone. So quite a lot of mott castles and around their holding, if you like, in central Antrim. So it may well be that that's part of the secret as to how they managed to control their land, which is effectively by copying Anglo-Norman military tactics. So conclusions. I've gone on far too long, but there's an oscillation in relationships between Ireland and Scotland, between Antrim and Argyll, and it's an oscillation that if you were a systems analyst, you would say that it was facilitated by easy transport across water, but that water can at times become blocked or interrupted by various different things, such as the Vikings. But across these eras, we can see continual trends of very similar groups either side of the channel. In the Mesolithic, we have clearly similar groups, but with a divergence growing. This is the hunter-gatherers, because of poor seamanship and the inability to be in regular contact. In the Neolithic period, we see again similar groups either side of the channel. But we have better technology, or they have better technology, so we can see trade and exchange and more regular contact between them. The Bronze Age settlers probably mostly replaced the Neolithic population. The limited amount of published DNA studies suggests that there's not much Neolithic DNA surviving after the Bronze Age settlers from the ultimate origin steps of Russia make their way across Europe and into Ireland and Scotland. But even then, they settle either side of the North Channel, and the North Channel seems to facilitate communication. And yet again, the same pattern of close communication and almost the same distribution network, southwest to northeast through Scotland, for bronzes that we saw with earlier porcelainite axes establishes itself, even though it's a completely different, or seems to be a completely different, or largely different population group. And then we get this strange hiatus in Ireland, 300 to 600 BC. As I said, I would speculate a little bit about this. Myself and a colleague of mine are wondering about actually when when there have been periods of migration between Ireland and Scotland. And we're wondering, is it possible, excuse me, to make a case that Ruada is even much earlier, I'm sorry, I'm starting to go a bit hoarse here, is even much earlier than some of the documentary sources which suggest 1st or 2nd century AD propose? Is it possible that Ruada might actually be a very ancient character who and that there is a memory of a very ancient migration to Scotland, which left Ireland depopulated because of environmental problems, because of deforestation? We think there was a lot of deforestation in Ireland at this time. By analogy, when we look at the parts of the Saxon shore and parts of Germany where the Anglo-Saxons migrated to in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries AD, to go to England, when the Anglo-Saxon migration happens to England, we see depopulation, relative depopulation in the parts of the Low Countries that they left from. So the idea that in Ulster and maybe even other parts of Ireland, that there was a migration into Western Britain, which then brings back new ideas of Latin art and stuff like that a few hundred years later, when people maybe bring ideas home, and then eventually maybe even a new migration, possibly stimulated by the Roman invasions, a new migration into Ireland from Britain. Sort of put the ideas that we're sort of passing around and thinking about, and seeing if we can find a theoretical model based on anthropological and migration theory that we could use to look at the archaeology that might be able to shed light on that. And then into the early medieval period, another period of intense contact, and one which still reverberates today. The name Dalriada, there's a Dalriada whiskey out there. There's Dalriada School, of course. We've got Dalriada used as a street name. There's even a Hungarian heavy metal band called Dalriada. So it's a name which continues to resonate down the ages, because it symbolizes something about ourselves in this part of the world, and something that's maybe best not tried to be defined too closely, and not tried to be grasped too hard by any individual or group, but just left floating around for us all to appreciate and feel a strange gra or hankering for, you know. So I'm going to finish now. I've been on far too long. I'm sure Nick, you're probably cursing me. As I said, it'd be an hour. I'm sure it must be heading for an hour and a half. But if there's any time for questions, I'll do my best to answer them, because it's a very big period. I don't know everything about it, and you may well know a lot more about some aspects of it than I do. So I'll stop sharing my screen and put my camera back on.
Wow, Cormac, thank you so much for that. That was really enlightening and a real illustration, I think, to steal the phrase from you, millennia of microtransactions. Yeah. Which is one that I'm certainly going to use in the future. I've always, in my talks, talked about the idea that there's constant back and forth, but you just summed it up so much better than I ever have. We'll open the floor up to any questions. There's a couple in the chat that I'll run through, and then if there's any others, we will get through those. Question from, is it Yvonne and Seamus? Aren't we all descended from Fergus MacEirk and Brian Boru?
Yeah. I think we are. We're probably we place far too much emphasis in our society on the patrilineal line. You know, if you actually go out and take into account not just one line, but taking all the lines, I think, yeah, you're probably right. You don't have to go that many generations back before we all start to become interrelated. I think if you go back to 5 or 6 generations, you got something like 35,000 cousins, I heard some that figure quote at one time, you know, with the average family sizes and stuff like that. So, yeah, basically we all are. But of course, for whatever reason, our society tends to focus, and many societies tend to focus on just one line, even though it's pretty irrational to do so.
Brian suggests that Campbell's critique is more about the Scots resenting the fact that one of their greater kingdoms was established by Irish foreigners.
Well, I don't think that's true about Ewan Campbell himself. I've met Ewan Campbell, and I don't think that he would be of that opinion. I suspect that some of the journalists who thought, "Wow, this is good. This is going to stir the pot. we're going to carry this in our newspaper," may have been playing on those sorts of ideas. And some people have suggested that it's somehow linked with different types of nationalisms. I think that both Irish and Scots nationalism and English nationalism, which exists too, I suppose, or British nationalism, maybe better, are all guilty of playing with these ideas of identity. But certainly both Irish and Scots nationalism have been keen to sort of adopt a sort of a separatist idea with regards to the whole Irish-Scots continuum thing. I know many people would consider, even some academics, that, well, academics don't really like to talk about countries very much, but the idea that historically Scotland and Ireland are a continuum, that one doesn't really stop and one doesn't really end, that really they're kind of the same place. But you could also extend that, say that about the whole of these islands, Britain and Ireland. I'm always interested in the way that if you go back to, well, it's still the case really in the Gaelic language, there was in early medieval Gaeldom, they talked about Irish was Gael, which meant anybody from Ireland and Scotland essentially, and then foreigner was Gal, and that meant essentially continental Europe. And then there was Saxon, but Saxon are specifically excluded from being foreigner, so in the usage of the term. So, that even in the early Middle Ages, that they had an idea that their relationships were a little bit complicated, so we put it like that, in these islands, and could not be simplified to binary oppositional sort of terms. And I don't think Campbell's doing that, but other people may have. I think it probably became important at some stage in the national myth of these islands, the national myths of these islands, to create separate Irish and Scottish identities. It happened piecemeal over a period of time. You can hear, Dr. Johnson, complaining about the Erse, by which he meant Highlanders or Irish. And then at some stage, maybe the Sir Walter Scott period, and maybe it was to do with the Home Rule crises, but it became important to integrate the Erse of Scotland into the more body politic, if you like, of this body politic is not the right term, but into the body of I don't know how to phrase this, legitimate Scottishness as it would have been viewed in the Victorian period. So, and at that stage, it may well have been that some people started to kick against this idea of Gaeldom, and I think that's something which is could be debated quite a lot. I suppose trying to tiptoe through all the pitfalls of discussing these things, but I mean, essentially, archaeology shouldn't really, and history should not get involved in contemporary political debates. They should try and keep it as isolated as possible, because really the lessons aren't there for the lessons are there with a broad brush for our current culture, but you can't draw direct political parallels because they're not us. They don't think like us, and they wouldn't necessarily understand or appreciate our concerns today. They would think they were probably silly, or intangible. So
I'm conscious of the fact that it's quite late and we're starting to lose people. So if we rush through a couple more questions, and then I might just try and take up a couple of minutes of people's time at the very end. So Peter has two related questions to do with Dunsebrick. One is, wasn't Olkin, later the Bishop of Armoy, found in Dunsebrick?
He doesn't seem to have been found in Dunsebrick. He seems to have been. There's actually there are a lot of these things. There are several slightly different conflicting stories. There's the Carnsetney, as mentioned. There's also a place called Drumbalkin, which is possibly Carnsetney as well, but which is just outside the village of Rishargan. in Mid-Antrim. And Drumbalkin is a low hill just to the northeast of the town, and of course the Church of Ireland church, which is now St Andrews, was up until the 18th century, I think, St Albans in Resharkin. And that's where it's generally considered, from the tripartite life and a number of other documentary references to saints' lives, that Alkin was born. But I think now, again, I think that he may have been made a bishop or maybe made a priest by Patrick at Dunseverick, and that's where Dunseverick comes in the story, I think. And I see the other question there is the archaeological evidence for Dunseverick being the royal centre.
Cormac, is that something that we might cover in more detail on? Actually,
yes.
Your next talk on the 10th. Yeah. We might skip on from that one if we could, purely to save time. Comment from Seamus. The Armagh poet, his name escapes him, of Scots and Irish ancestry, has a poem that begins, "We are a through other people."
Is that that wouldn't be the W.F. Marshall, would it? The Bard of Tyrone, maybe? No, I don't know. I'm living in Drumlister and all that sort of.
Clever to the knee.
my father was a great fan of W.F. Marshall. Brilliant poet, fantastic. But I'm not sure. But it's a great line. We certainly are.
A last observation before we move on to the dreaded evaluation talk, and that is that the story of Picts being in Ireland.
Yes.
There's, of course, a folkloric memory of that in North Antrim.
Yes.
There is a type of fairy called a Pect, P-E-C-T, and these are remembered as the mound builders. So you have to wonder where the link is and where the lines blur or the horizon blurs there between cultural memory and folklore.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. I've been told that before. What's the origin of the story? It is just folklore, isn't it? Yes.
As far as I can tell, we certainly in our collection have records of it going back or being recorded in the 19th century, of stories of Picts being these mound builders, and they're described as short, hairy fairies with very large feet, and when it rains, they sit on their shoulders and put their feet above them and shelter themselves from the rain. So, that they've clearly assumed this really mythological status, but the connection there with hill forts, I think is quite interesting.
That's very interesting, extremely.
Folks, I'd just like to say on behalf of Museum Service and Good Relations who are funding this, thank you very much, Cormac, for that fascinating talk. You are back with us, I think, on the 10th of February to talk about the royal sites of the North Coast. So thank you very, very much for this evening.
Not at all, thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording and talk very briefly about evaluations, if I could.